I'm just exploring what the future looks like, and I'm not in any real rush because, of course, the confidence is growing the last couple of weeks as COVID deaths have really slowed. But before that, it was, who knew what the future was going to hold? And, if we opened a restaurant again quickly and spent a lot of money and then COVID strikes again, we could be in real trouble. So it's very sensitive, and I've just got to take it one step at a time.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. The pandemic has changed the hospitality sector globally forever. We've seen some of the world's very best restaurants close, local hubs of the community fold, but we've also seen incredible fighting spirit that has seen many adapt, evolve, and change course. With some fresh air and time to rediscover themselves, some are finding new opportunities that they may not have had the opportunity to explore. Brett Graham is the chef of the Ledbury in London. Brett, how are you going?
Very good, thanks, mate.
Well, it's good to have you on. There's a lot to talk about, but what's it like in London at the moment?
Yeah, I think the sort of, I've just returned about half an hour ago from getting my vaccine, and incredibly well organised, and they're really getting through it quickly, and I think that's restoring confidence with everybody who lives here, especially when you can see other parts of Europe sort of struggling with getting the vaccine out to as many people as possible. And I think I heard yesterday somewhere there's about 30 years, the 30-year age group behind England. So they've done amazingly well, and that's restoring confidence, but slowly starting to return to normal. I think, as you know, probably you might not know, but restaurants are reopening indoors on the 17th of May. And initially still wearing face masks, coverings for the staff, and when you get up from the table. So I think probably only a month or two after that it should return to sort of normal service, I guess. So confidence is coming back, and we're getting back to normal.
I know that there's been the furlough system that's been put in place by the government there, but what sort of impact do you think that this is going to have on the hospitality sector? Yeah,
I think I always look at stuff, especially in our trade. I've always sort of tried to look about, what happens to a restaurant or the decisions you make don't sort of affect you immediately. It always is sort of like a bit of a time gap until you see the real effects of something that happens. And a pandemic like this, I think people are really excited about going back to restaurants. Restaurateurs and chefs and waiters and everybody's ready to go back to work and very keen to get back to work. And of course, the furlough scheme has helped a lot. I was worried at the start if the government didn't implement something, there could have been some sort of civil unrest. Because, having been involved in the riots many years ago and seeing what that happened, how that unfolded in London, I thought that could be a real problem. But the government, I think, did a fantastic job getting this furlough scheme rolled out as quick as they did, and definitely, helped a lot of people who were struggling in the hospitality sector. I think the really hard thing we're going to see going forward, probably on the back of, well, not just mentioning the furlough scheme, but on the subject of staff, is that, hospitality in England is a very mixed bag of people from all different parts of Europe and the rest of the world. But Europe has a really strong presence in the staffing makeup of how, restaurants are made up of the people that work there. When I first came here 20-something years ago, there was a lot of French staff, and then it sort of moved into Italians, and then there was some more Polish, and now there's a real nice mix with some Bulgarians and a really nice sort of European mix of staff, much more evenly spread from different places. I think a lot of those people, when furlough came on as well, thought, well, I'm going to go home to mum and dad, and went home to their home country, and they probably won't come back, and it's going to see a huge shortage of staff here, massive shortage, I think. So I think it's also now, but 6 months down the track, it's going to be very difficult.
The Ledbury has its doors shut for over a year now, and we can talk about that shortly. But we've had some people on the podcast that have worked with you or done stages at the Ledbury, and they sort of, most of them talked about how you're the hardest working chef that they've ever experienced. For someone that's so committed to their job, how have you been spending your time, and what sort of impact has that had on you in the last year?
Yeah, I guess, running a small business is, one of the things that gets me up in the morning. And I think I sort of saw that from my old man. He had a business when I was a boy, and he always was committed to working there, probably more hours than he needed to, but he was there a lot. And that sort of taught me dedication to, making sure you do a good job and focus to make sure you can succeed. And I've definitely done that at the Ledbury. We've been open for 16 years. And on the night we closed, we had an incredibly successful business, pretty much always fully booked. Only a small site. It wasn't in the West End, so everything was sort of a reasonable rent, a reasonable staffing. So it was a very profitable business. And, I was extremely proud to be the chef there. But when this pandemic came, there were so many things going through my head. One of them was, more so, how are we going to be able to meet these guidelines? Because they came in very quickly, obviously. We were ordered to close. And then after you think, right, this is going to go on for a long time, I sort of sat down in the first couple of days and thought, right, the whole world is stopping here. This is affecting the whole world. This is not going to recover in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or 2 months. And so I was working towards the idea of closing. And everybody thought that was a crazy idea. But I kept thinking long term, like, what's it going to look like in 6 months? Will there be international people back? Will there be tourists here? Will anybody be living in London that doesn't need to be here in this highly populated area? And all those questions led me to the path of closing. And so as soon as I decided that's what we were going to do, I probably was nervous that I didn't quite know at that stage, nor did anybody, how infectious this disease could be. And I knew in my little tiny kitchen and my little tiny dining room and the stairs that go down to the toilet, we couldn't socially distance even at 1 metre. And at that stage, I was suggesting a 2 metre rule. And I probably thought, I don't want my conscience that some young kids come to work at my restaurant and because I've decided I'll open against sort of guidelines, somebody gets ill and, the worst happens. Of course, as it folded out, we realised it didn't affect young people as much as it has older people. But still, that's what sort of guided my sort of decision. And the lack of, international tourists in London restaurants, in fine dining restaurants in London is massive. The amount of Americans we get, slightly different to Australia's demographic of tourists, but get a huge amount of Americans, some internationals passing through for one night, going to the theatre, flying on to Europe perhaps, but still, spending well, always fully booked, and, just the concentration of people. And, changed the way sort of people thought about hospitality at that time. Yeah, so I guess I think I had about 24 hours where I sat on the sofa for 4 or 5 hours, and I turned on this thing, Netflix, and started watching it. And my wife came over to the sofa and said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm not sure." And she said, "I've never seen you watch TV for more than 25 minutes." And I was about 2 hours in. And then the next day, I guess I sort of shook myself off and said, right, I've got to sort of get myself organized here. What am I going to do? How am I going to diversify? And so I had already started farming some deer. I had a few deer parks, probably had a couple of 100 deer by that stage. And so I thought, right, I'm going to ramp that up a bit. I'm going to explore other avenues of things that I think of ingredients that I used at the Ledbury and sort of explore about how I could produce them myself. So I think about 6 or 8 weeks in, I managed to get, after many, many, many hours and vets and Spanish people helping me and the genetics expert helping me, I managed to get the first herd of Iberian pigs out of Spain on an air-conditioned truck. Because I didn't want to get turned back. It was like sort of early June, it could be hot days, and obviously really concerned about animal welfare, make sure we do everything properly, everything correct. And so I got them out of Spain, and then I bought some sheep, a couple of 100 sheep, and then I bought some old Jersey cows to do an experiment on repurposing an old dairy animal, not like your sort of classic Holstein Friesian, but a smaller sort of carcass, and see how that worked. More sort of thinking about regenerative farming, more minimal or no use of like chemicals or antibiotics, and ways which we could keep dosage low of those things. So I found different farmers who were the right people, and I went about sort of I started this little farming business called Capability Graham, and we've now got 150 Iberian pigs and some oak tree woods in Hereford near the Welsh border, and I've got about 1,000 deer and a dozen cows and 100 sheep left, I think. So yeah, and working with all different sort of people to work out how we can lessen the impact. And one of the things as a chef that we sort of don't quite look at, we're so focused on that end product and the ingredient, we forget about what that animal eats. And we've just done one of the first sort of commercial diets done for pigs without any soy. And that's been a real long sort of project, but we've got that over the line now. And I've almost now finished the complete diet. So from when they're born to when they're finished, they'll have 0 soy in their feed. And that's a big thing, because people, when talking about food miles, you can look at a piece of pork and say, yeah, it was grown around the corner or in some little farm free range. But if that pig has consumed 650 kilos of feed in its life, and 400 kilos of that was, or 200 or 300 kilos of that was soy from the Amazonian basin, or a big farm in America, it's sort of, the footprint's a lot bigger than you think. And so I really tried to get under the skin of how food is produced, and sort of try to understand it. So that's what's been keeping me busy.
You've been very busy. This exploration into sort of new ingredients and the agricultural side of things, what sort of impact has that had on you and your approach to cookery?
It's made me much more respectful of. I already had a great relationship with farmers. I was very well connected to them, and I already understood. But what it really made me realise is, like, it's not being critical of chefs, because they always got so much on their plate and were so busy and work crazy hours and unsociable hours, and we work really hard. But I started asking questions to people I work with, like, how long does it take to incubate a chicken egg? What kind of feed do you think that Wagyu beef is eaten, or how much grain do you think is consumed in its life to end up as a 200-gram steak on your plate, or how much water does it take to make a litre of almond milk, or all these things. And quite often chefs don't know, and it's not a criticism, like I said, of a chef. It's just that I felt more of a responsibility to find out, because we can think something's local, and in fact it's not local. And there's all sorts of different ingredients, and animal feed should be a bit like our food that we eat. We should be able to read the ingredients and understand what it is, and understand why that ingredient's there, and how it's being treated, and what preservatives are in it. So yeah, it's been a whole sort of educational, sort of discovery for me of actually how hard it is to produce things to a very high level, and especially trying to do it in a more regenerative way. It's been amazing, and so many amazing farmers out there that deserve credit as much as chefs do, and they get nothing. Don't get any credit, or they just get such a poor return. And in fact, one of the things that really just baffles me is last week, sometimes I just look on the normal, like market scores for the price of animals, and the price per kilo of pork at the abattoir, what they were paying at the start of coronavirus was £1.67. And last week was about £1.30. £1.30 for a kilo of pork is cheaper than a 500 ml bottle of San Pellegrino sparkling water. I mean, how can you figure that? How does that work? And how have we got into that state? So farmers are losing about £10 a pig at the moment. Their margins are so slim that they're making good money if they're doing £10 a pig, because they're doing 400 or 500 pigs a week. But it's just so slim. And I mean, how can we demand as consumers that they have high animal welfare standards? How can we, demand that they care about where their food comes from when the margins are that slim, and when we're drinking a bottle of water that's worth more than their homegrown animals? So yeah, lots of things like that have come to light.
You've won so many accolades, and even reached number 10 in the world with the restaurant, and won best restaurant in the UK many times. But you started back here in Australia, grew up here in Newcastle. Tell us about those early days, and why did you start a career in hospitality?
Well, actually, I'm actually weird. It sort of comes full circle because I'm really involved now with animal husbandry, but I always wanted to be a vet, and no one in my family cooked. So I never really had any sort of reason to be interested in it. And quite often you hear chefs like talking about, especially European ones, they, out in the backyard picking apricots with their grandma. That definitely wasn't me in Australia. It was more of a like, I don't know what we used to do, but, making a frozen pizza base on a Sunday night and putting pineapple on it. That was about the level of creativity of our culinary sort of experiments at home. But like a lot of Australians in my generation, food was just partly fuel or partly it was just a really good way of, I remember like Dad would cook the barbecue, or the blokes would stand around the barbecue, cook the barbecue, pour a tin of beer on the onions, and the mums would be making a salad over on the other side, and everyone was sort of joined together to some sort of like rolling buffet of half-burnt, well-done meat, and, some... and a table of salads. So I sort of grew up like that. And when school work experience came along, my number one thing was to be a vet, to go to work, do experience in a vets, except a 14-year-old or whatever I was then. I think 14, a 14-year-old kid going to work in a place where you have drugs for animals and all sorts of stuff's not allowed, as you can imagine. So my second choice was a chef. And that was because, because I'd probably had some interest in it, but I hadn't really had much experience. And so I went to work at Scratchley's on the wharf, and I absolutely loved it. And I don't know whether I loved it because I loved work, but I was probably, by the end of the week, I could sort of work out what chefs were doing stuff like something really simple, right? Probably like some guy cooking a garlic bread under the salamander and pull it down, and it's beautiful and golden and looks lovely to me. But I never at that stage, I'd never seen anyone cook a chip before, like hot chips. Like I'd never seen that before. I've obviously eaten them before, but I'd never seen it. I was quite amazed of like people frying chips, and they were hot and steaming and beautiful, and making Kilpatrick oysters under the salamander, so the bacon was all crispy. And I was quite taken by that because I'd never seen that process. And then I'd seen the sort of difference of level of chefs presenting stuff to go out to the table. I think probably I was even impressed by someone like Van Dyking a tomato on a seafood platter. And I thought there was some sort of like world of creativity that I hadn't been exposed to. And it sort of struck a chord with me. So I worked hard, and I think a couple of days in, the owner, who's a really great mate of mine called Neil Slater, he offered me a job. And I think Mum and Dad went in to see him because I think I was 15 maybe. And 15 I was, yeah. And he offered me a job, and I started straight away. I said, absolutely. And stayed there for 2.5 years, and learned so much there. Lots of real basic skills, and learned how to work hard and be focused. And it was a fantastic first job.
You ended up moving to Sydney and working for Liam Tomlin at Bank, which has some amazing chefs have come out of that kitchen. But during that time, you won the Josephine Pinlay Award. Tell us a bit about your experience at Bank and what that award, how that changed your career.
Yeah, I think probably the most important part of my career ever was working at Bank. I was completely out of my depth. I had no idea that like there was some sort of hierarchy. I didn't realise being a chef was a bit like being in the army. Like sort of you come in, yes sir, whatever. But I'll come in and start. I'd come in, Liam would be standing on the pass, and I'd go up and say, "Oh, I've had a day off." I come in and say, "Hello, mate, how are you, bud?" Slap him on the back sort of almost and try and give him a high five. And I was like 18 years old. And he sort of looked at me like go away from me sort of thing. And I sort of thought, he's obviously had a bad weekend, like I had no idea there was any sort of like, that sort of like, yes, sir. And you just carried on with your work. And I remember thinking I was being incredibly helpful on the first day, and Liam called on a check. And it was the very first table. I remember clearly it was like Stan, one of the owners with Liam and Rodney Adler were in for lunch or something. And he shouts on this order, and he says, Samaj, 2 covers, Rianavon. And I think that means like straight to mains, like only main course. So it doesn't mean no starter. So he calls on this Rihanna Von check, and the next day, same thing happens. First table comes in, he calls on Rihanna Von, and I go around the pass and I say to him, Liam, like, that guy, Mr. Rihanna Von, he was in for lunch yesterday, just so you know. And he comes around and goes like, if you say one more stupid thing to me, you're out, you're gonna go, you're gonna leave. And it took me about 2 weeks to work out why he wanted to sack me, because I had no idea what it meant. Like, I had no idea what he meant. And so there were so many occasions like that, that he would sort of say to me all these crazy things. I had no idea what's going on, and I'd just respond with a silly answer. Like, I'll go up to the parcel, say something like, Liam, I've been reading recipes last night when I got home, and I found a chef in England called Michael Ruick's. Have you heard of him? And he would just say, mate, I was obviously just saying it how I saw it in the cookbook. And that's sort of how my life went for the first 6 months at the bank. A bit sort of bumbling along, keeping Newcastle. But I remember, the hours were incredibly tough, like nothing I've even probably done since then. There were days when we were starting at 6 o'clock in the morning. I think chefs always have some sort of hero story about how many hours they worked, and normally it's exaggerated, but in this case, it was really like that. And people were leaving left, right, and centre. People wouldn't come back from their breaks, and so you're always just about in the first 6 months. There was only the pastry chef. Me and Liam left from the original team after 6 months. That's how tough it was. Like, it was really tough. So I ended up on sauce. So one of the bigger jobs, because the kitchen had been sort of emptied. And I think I came in a couple of times. Like, once I remember coming in really tired, like exhausted, and I went up to Liam and said, Liam, I've got a headache. I'm so tired. I've been working so many hours the last couple of months. I just feel terrible, sort of, exhausted sort of thing. And he said something like along the lines of me, like he was smoking a cigarette in the dining room, as you did in those days in the morning, about 9 o'clock in the morning, on about his fourth espresso and his fourth cigarette. And he looked up and said to me, why don't you just go back to Newcastle and live in a windmill, something like that. And I sort of went, that's it? Like, is that it? I was only 19. And so I went back in the kitchen and thought, well, he's given me a choice, hasn't he? I can either go now or I can stay. And I stayed. I wasn't going to let him get the satisfaction of beating me. But that said, it was a fantastic place to work. Like, the energy was amazing. The drive was amazing. The culture was great. Liam pushed people hard, taught people lots of lessons, and taught me lots of lessons. And I think he was a big part of a turning point of when I sort of shook off that "she'll be right, mate" sort of Australian attitude that I felt I had. And I don't mean that sort of sweeping statement, but I mean, I had that sort of typical, like, it doesn't really matter. That doesn't really matter. But the small details in kitchens do matter. And Liam, because he was there and he led from the front, there was no, you couldn't say anything. He was in the trenches with us, and that's what I enjoyed. And that's what I've tried to do at the Ledbury, be in the trenches with the guys. Don't tell them to do one thing, but not prepared to do it yourself. And so Bank was a huge learning curve. And then the Josephine Pignolet Award came, and it was Matt Kemp, who worked there actually, that said to me, you'd get on really well at the Square. You'll love Phil Howard. He's a really great guy. You'll love there. I'll organise you a trial when you get there. So Matt organised a trial, and I flew over, and then I had a trial at the Square a couple of days after I arrived.
And you ended up securing a job there for 3 years. How different was that to working in Australia?
Well, I'd already been preconditioned, I think, because if you looked around the kitchen, you had, like, I guess in the same kitchen we had Warren Turnbull and Matt that I just mentioned, and Colin Fasnich, and all those sort of guys who'd worked over here in Europe. Justin North, that was all in the same brigade. So I guess I'd already been preconditioned by those boys to be tough enough to sort of, come into a London kitchen, which was not typical of an Australian kitchen in those days. So I was pleased for that experience. At Bank, it really helped me get on. But I think I felt it was easier here than it was in Australia because of the hours were a bit less here. The living conditions were harder. And as anyone who lived in London knows, the standard of living in Australia for your salary is much better. So there were challenges, lots of challenges in the first year or two, which I sort of overcome. And yeah, I was at the Square for, nearly 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. And then Phil had asked me if I wanted to open a restaurant with him. And then we found the Ledbury.
Well, tell us about those early days and what your vision for the Ledbury was. You gained a Michelin star the following year, just after you opened. Well, what was it like, that period of time?
That was probably the toughest part of my life mentally. Very, very difficult. I really struggled, and I really struggled. I really struggled probably with feeling like I was only 25, I guess. So, but I felt like I was letting people down. Like I thought, oh, this restaurant's going to fail. It's not going to work. All these sort of emotions go through your mind. And I always think like it's easier to be critical of other people, or it's easier to stand back and say, oh, that guy's got this restaurant, or this person's running this place as a head chef. But until you're in the hot seat and until that pressure's on you, you don't actually know what it feels like. And every morning I still carry a huge responsibility, especially the Harwood as well. But I carried this huge responsibility of walking in there every day and seeing 40 people at the Ledbury or 44 people at Ledbury in total staff to 20-something at the Harwood. Realise I'm sort of in some way quite responsible for 60-something people's jobs, and making sure that we have an income that we can pay them, make sure the restaurants stay busy. So I probably took that a little bit hard on the early days. I took that a little bit too seriously, and I blamed myself for anything that went wrong. So quite hard on myself, and I did struggle with that at the start. But we got our first Michelin star. Did not even fill me with joy at all. It made it worse because I felt more pressure and more stress. I never have woken up in the morning thinking that, and I thought I would after working with Liam all those years ago, because he used to talk about the Michelin Guide a lot. And I didn't know what it was, of course, because, if to a young Australian boy, the Michelin Guide sounds like it's a brand of tractor tyre that I knew that my dad, so I didn't know what I had no idea why they were talking about that. And I was just too worried to even ask them why they were talking about a tyre brand to do with food. And so then I sort of, before I came over here, I then realised sort of what it was and how important it was. But when we got our first start, did not even celebrate one bit. I actually remember it being a really tough day. And Shane Osborne, a fellow Australian, called me and said, you've just got a Michelin star. And I sort of said, what? What do you mean? He said, well, I've just seen the Michelin Guide. And I was scrubbing sort of area down on the floor, down near where the phone was. And I just returned back to doing it. And it didn't change a single thing for me. And it felt like more pressure mounted on me. Because remember, I think we opened in about the April, and that came out at the start of January the following year. So incredibly quick to get a star. And apparently they'd had lots of visits. And we'd had mixed reviews. We'd had a horrible review from Michael Winner, who just suggested the Ledbury would be better as a car park, because that would be a bit more useful in Notting Hill than a restaurant. And I remember actually he said a comment something like, we had this what must have been like, we had this like chocolate souffle on the menu with honeycomb and banana ice cream, very classical, very old school at the start. And he said it was the worst dessert he'd ever eaten in his life. And one of our customers, we had a couple of sort of regulars. One of them had replied to me in the Sunday paper saying, Michael, I can see by your picture you're a world expert in desserts. And that was the first customer I ever gave a bottle of champagne to. So we had a sort of like up and down. That was a bad review. We had some good ones as well. Some really good ones, actually, with some really beautiful ones. So it was a bit up and down, and you would find our feet. Weren't incredibly busy. Just had my head down. I didn't have any vision for the Ledbury at that stage, really. I was just cooking variations of things I might have learnt at the Square, sort of just to get by, a few new things, but that sort of spirit was still involved in my cooking. I'd still sort of, I was still cooking the way I'd sort of been taught to cook in those early days. And so that was sort of how it sort of started. And then as it progressed, the style started to change. The vision became a bit clearer. One of the things that was really different at the start was that the service here was a bit less friendly than, say, in Australia. So here I found the service quite European and stiff, and almost a bit arrogant towards customers. And after about year 2 or year 3, I was like, right, what are we doing? Why are we speaking to customers like this? Why are we like following like a robot around the dining room, saying the same thing to the same table, or, you know, why hear a waiter saying good evening, sir, to a 22-year-old and good evening, sir, to a 78-year-old? You know, and I started to really talk about how can we make people feel different and how can we make different tables feel different. And that's sort of really, I felt like the penny dropped after about year 3 or year 4 and thought, right, we're in hospitality, and actually a lot of restaurants aren't very hospitable. You know, that you come in, you feel intimidated by the sommelier who looks down on you because you're drinking a beer with your starter. You know, why not? You know, like, or looks down at somebody perhaps who can't afford a very expensive bottle of wine, or a waiter who's inflexible with the menu. And I guess that's where the sort of vision sort of, you know, started to come from, was that sort of basis of looking after people and, you know, thinking about the real meaning of hospitality and doing it because it's in our culture and in our blood, not because we've read it in a book or read it in the, you know, the order of service that the manager's given us all.
Well, the Ledbury has won the most extraordinary awards, too many to list, but why do you think it was so successful, and what's your proudest sort of moment about the Ledbury?
I think probably an accumulation of all the things that we've done over the years have been sort of like, I think the proudest thing for me is when somebody leaves the Ledbury and goes away with that culture and that spirit that I've been trying to push into the staff all the time, and they go away and they sort of say, you know, and quite often I get notes from people saying, oh God, like, you know, I've just opened my first restaurant, and all those things I saw you doing all the time, oh my God, what a difference it's made. And that's made an effect on their career and their future. That's the real thing that makes me really proud, actually, is that there's a sort of legacy and a culture and a sort of, you know, some sort of protégés that have worked there have gone on to senior jobs or, you know, like I said, open their own places. But I guess the thing that probably, things that I enjoy is like the best achievements for me is I can remember maybe 20 times things that we've done for customers that I've seen people feel emotional about, or perhaps they'll never forget it for the rest of their life. That's a real achievement for me. Or people have come there 20, 30. We've had customers, quite a few customers, over 100 visits. And that's really good. That's really important to us. It's like, you know, that's the biggest and best thing for us. And it's when people take time to write notes to us. That's really special, because, you know, it doesn't happen very much. But on the sort of actual award front, I think when we got number 1, I think 3 times, I think it was in a row or something in England for the restaurant awards, that was a really big thing for me, because I thought, you know, no one else has ever done it. But with awards, it's sort of like, right, let's give it to someone else, or let's sort of work out, or people are going to, their sort of preferences are going to change, or their number 1's going to change to number 2, number 3, and that obviously affects the voting every year, because people are, I'm not going to vote for those guys again, I voted for them last year. And that's what made me realise that we were incredibly strong in terms of reputation, and that made me really proud, I guess, after so many years.
You mentioned a part of what makes you feel really proud is the legacy of people that have worked with you and what they take away. But the legacy also stretches back to the Hunter, and there's a Brett Graham scholarship, and the Hunter Culinary Association has a food fight, and you're involved in the program. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah. So it was a TAFE teacher originally called Reinhold Foster, and he had this idea that he would start this award, or at least explore the idea of having this award. And I hadn't even opened the Ledbury then, and I thought it was a little bit sort of premature. I sort of thought, you know, what am I doing for some young kid, like, you know, in London as a chef de partie, like doing an award to sort of inspire people from Newcastle? That was just me being a bit like, I thought I should have been 50 years old before that happened. But, you know, do you know what I mean? Like a bit of a sort of like a bit, I thought it was a bit premature. It's like, I haven't done anything yet. But the reason why I agreed to it was because when I was cooking at Hamilton TAFE in Newcastle, I was working at Scratchley's, and I went in a competition, and I did the most like funniest start. It was like something like, you know, segments of orange, grapefruit, and something else in a coupe class, like an old-fashioned sort of starter. Like you'd have, I think sometimes in the 1970s, people used to have half a grapefruit as a starter. And I did some sort of starter based on that, and it was so far off what some of the other guys had done who were working perhaps in a fancy restaurant in Hunter Valley, and I was quite a bit younger than them as well. And I sort of felt a bit out on my own, because there was sort of that group of older guys and girls who were driving cars and whatever, and I was too young to drive a car, and I was sort of sat by myself, really trying to do my very best and try hard. And anyway, I went through this competition and I actually won it in the end. And it taught me a real lesson. Like, it doesn't matter where you're working or where you're from. If you want it, or you spend that sort of, or begin that journey of that 10,000 hours of practice, that you can actually make it, and you can make, doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. And that's the reason why I really wanted the scholarship to be involved in it, because I wanted to find those people who were good, who were going to try hard, who really wanted to travel, perhaps didn't have the financial means to travel. And that's sort of where it really started for me. It was like, right, I want people to have the chance that I had. Because I didn't really have much money. I probably might not have come under my own steam at that time. Maybe not. And there was a scholarship that helped me. The Josephine Pignolet one, of course, I mean, for me. But I wanted to help others, like the Josephine Pignolet scholarship helped me.
So what does the scholarship give people that are chefs that are part of it? Yeah,
so it allows them enough money to come over to England, to stay here for as long as they want to stay here, travel. They come and work at the Ledbury. They can work at the Harwood. I send them normally out to some places for dinner to experience different restaurants, or a stage, or from now on they'll be coming to, go through all the stuff I do with the farming as well as part of the curriculum for them to get an experience for them. Some of them stay, some of them, if you look through the list, I think there's 17 winners there. One of them's a sous chef at a restaurant called Le Trompette in Chiswick, which is the chef is a mate of mine. It's owned by one of my business partners, and he's a sous chef there. Well, he came over on the scholarship and never went back. And he's a fantastic young guy called Alex Top. And a lot of those people through that whole list, you see, all those guys have done so well. Troy, I remember Troy Rhodes Brown. I don't know if you probably know him, I think.
Yes, very well.
And what a fantastic guy. I mean, a wonderful job. He was just come over to work for us before he opened his restaurant. And, I tried to help him, be exposed to as much as I could at that stage. And a lot of them, I'm incredibly proud of what they've all done, actually. And I'm looking forward to more of them coming. A bit of an interruption in the last year or two, but, trying to sort of, and hopefully they then bring something back, that energy and culture, and just being exposed to a different, cuisine and a different demographic, I think really helps the hunter.
You opened the Ledbury 16 years ago, and you mentioned a bit earlier the 17th of May restaurants can open indoors again. What's your feeling about cooking again and getting back into the hospitality game?
Yeah, I'm really, I feel slightly anxious about it because it's a big ask. It's always been a big ask on all the people that work in hospitality, front of house and kitchen. Like, it's a commitment, and we work hard, focus, driven every day, unsociable hours. So everybody in the hospitality industry, I think everyone feels a bit anxious about it. Going back to work, finding their rhythm again, rebuilding their lives a little bit, perhaps financially. It's obviously, as you know, it's affected lots of people. And that's going to be a real big challenge for everybody. The big challenge is going to be not enough staff to support each other because of the reasons I explained earlier, where people have gone back to their homes in Europe, and us coming out of Brexit has made it harder for them to come back. Should have to sponsor them. Whereas before there was just free movement. You could wake up on a Friday morning and catch a train over here on Friday night and be working on Saturday in a restaurant in London if you're, say, French. Now it doesn't work like that. So that's going to make it very difficult for those in hospitality. The Harwood is reopening on the 17th, and I have my old head chef from the Ledbury, a young boy called Jake Leach, a fabulous young guy, and he's taking his first head chef's job, so I've been able to support him with both a bit of menu stuff and some ingredient stuff, but I'll be by his side to help him get through his first couple of weeks really well. And we got the team made up of partly people who were there before and some new people I brought in from the Ledbury. Just a couple who were sort of at a loose end. And so I'm really excited with the Harwood, actually. I've never really spent a lot of time there before the last closure because, I was always focused at Ledbury. So I'd be there more as an advisory role or pop in on the way home or have lunch there once every 3 weeks or something like that. But because I was such a working person at the Ledbury, I wasn't working at the Harwood in terms of being there. And now I'm there a lot more. I go to meetings now more and give them inspiration a bit more and help them menus more and go to tastings and, that sort of thing. So I'm really keen and really enthused to be involved more on the front line and, trying to work out how we can use some of these ingredients in a restaurant in the pub.
The Ledbury's footprint on the culinary landscape in the UK is unquestionable. It's been absolutely extraordinary. And as you say, the pub will be open on the 17th. Will there be more plans for you beyond that you have in the works at the moment? Yeah, I'm just exploring actually how I want to proceed and what I want to do going forward. It's a real difficult thing, like I'm not one of these guys who wants to branch out and own 15 restaurants. So I don't think, you just look at history of how people have done expansions like that or chefs that have tried to open 2 or 3 restaurants at the same time and it doesn't go well, and I'm really aware of that. You can't spread yourself too thin and you forget sometimes that you actually are a really important part of a restaurant culture, and by being there is an important thing. Once you open 2 or 3 restaurants, it's fine. Like I always say, it's fine for the first 6 months, it's fine for this year, it's fine for a year and a half. It's not fine when your head chef leaves or your sous chefs leave or whatever, and you don't go back into, make sure that you respond by giving that place lots of energy and making sure all the customers and the staff and everyone's all joined up. That's where it goes wrong. So, I do only want to really think about single restaurants and I don't want to be involved in sort of a range of different restaurants. I'm just exploring what the future looks like. And I'm not in any real rush because, of course, the confidence is growing the last couple of weeks as COVID deaths have really slowed. But before that, it was, who knew what the future was going to hold? And, if we opened a restaurant again quickly and spent a lot of money and then COVID strikes again, we could be in real trouble. So it's very sensitive and I've just got to take it one step at a time. Well, I'm sure everyone in Australia and the UK and all over the globe are very much looking forward to seeing what your next step is. Brett, we've absolutely been honoured to have you on Deep in the Weeds today to hear your story. Please keep in touch and we'll catch up again soon. Thank you very much, mate. I've really, really enjoyed being on here. Thank you. This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we share the stories of Australia's hospo community, suppliers and producers in search of hope during this pandemic. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.